Earlier, we talked about how EU countries view China. In this episode, we will explore how Chinese common people view other major powers. We will discover Chinese public opinion in 8 categories. The first one is the Chinese overall perception on foreign major powers. The second one is the mirror attitudes, meaning if I like you, you like me back. In other words, if Chinese people think that other countries like them, and if yes, what are the other countries? The third one is the first associations with major powers, meaning what is the first word or phrase comes to Chinese mind when other major powers are mentioned. The fourth one talks about Chinese attitudes toward the power distribution. The fifth category deals with COVID-19 vaccines and the diplomacy related to it. The sixth one discovers the Chinese perceptions about the distribution of power. The seventh one articulates the foreign policy preferences, and the last but not the least, the eighth one tells us about Chinese views on other ethnic entities such as Taiwan and Hong Kong.
So let's begin with our first category, which is Chinese people's overall perception of foreign countries. Chinese respondents were asked to rate their feeling toward 25 countries on a scale from 0 to 100. And amongst them, 79.8% of the respondents said they view Russia in a positive light, while only 12% held negative views. While Russia turned out to be the most positively perceived country in China, followed by Pakistan and Singapore, the most negatively viewed countries are the US, India, Japan, and Vietnam. A past survey result conducted between 2008 and 2015 shows that only around 50% of Chinese respondents held positive views of Russia by then. In contrast, in 2022, after Russia-Ukraine war, almost 80% of Chinese respondents reported their positive views of Russia, which has improved by 30% over last 3 years. When the respondents were asked to provide reasons for the change in their sentiments, especially the reason of improvement in their sentiments towards Russia, they mentioned the strength of the country and the leadership. In relation to this, the expressions like trust Putin, Putin has guts, strong leadership, brotherly love, enemy of an enemy is our friend, these expressions got popular in China. Here we could see the general view of Russia got better by 78.66% in last 3 years. In contrast, during the same period of time, the general view of the United States got worse by around 60%. When asked to explain why the respondents' view of the US has changed, the common reasons include the mismanagement of COVID-19 crisis by the US government, American hegemony, and the tendency of the US to instigate wars, meddle in other countries' affairs. Particularly common adjectives included bossy, arrogant, selfish, shameless, unfriendly, retarded, and vicious. This outcome of this public opinion survey reflects the bilateral relationships between a specific country and China. When asked about respondents' assessment of foreign policy of a certain great powers, Chinese respondents evaluated their own country's foreign policy most positively, followed by Russia, which was also assessed as decisively positive by slightly more than 73% of the respondents. The foreign policies of other great powers were seen predominantly negatively. Mirrored attitudes, meaning if I like you, you like me. It has been noted in general, Chinese respondents' view correspond closely with their perceptions of those countries' views of China. So let's understand with an example. So more than 60% of Chinese respondents view the United States negatively, while a nearly identical proportion indicated they believe the United States also view China negatively. The same pattern has also been noted in the case of Japan and India. However, in case of France and Germany, Chinese respondents are too optimistic in their estimates of how China is perceived in these two countries, because Even though China's view of France and Germany are assessed positively by 55% and 60% respectively, however, French and German views on China are quite negative. In relation to cultural similarities and dissimilarities, the Chinese respondents replied that the Singaporean and the North Korean culture are most similar to China, while the US and the Indian culture are most dissimilar to China. Now let's have a look on the first associations with Russia and the US. United States was commonly thought of as an advanced and powerful state, yet hostile to China, untrustworthy and having a tendency to interfere in countries' affairs. Hegemon was the most prevalent association that appeared among the responses, followed by advanced technology, bossy, developed economy, powerful, and war. Furthermore, COVID-19 was also a frequently mentioned association with America following right after war. When it comes to Russia, the first associations were mostly positive. Many associations seem to be based upon stereotypes such as vodka, beautiful girls, and adjectives such as vast and cold. However, for Russia, the most frequently mentioned first association is the warrior nation. Now let's have a look Chinese people's attitudes towards the main powers. Russia was the top desired location to visit for more than 58% of respondents, followed by Singapore and Japan. On the contrary, the US was one of the least desired travel destinations. As an educational destination, Russia also appeared to be one of the most recommended countries for pursuing higher education among the Chinese, behind only China itself, Singapore, and the United Kingdom. The next category is COVID-19 vaccines and diplomacy. Only 30% of Chinese respondents claimed that they would be willing to be immunized with the European and American vaccines. Almost 93% of respondents have faith in China-made vaccines, followed by Russia-made vaccines. The following category is about perceived distribution of power. Economically, China was perceived as the most powerful country ahead of the US and the EU. In terms of military power, China was seen also as superior to other great powers, slightly ahead of Russia and the US. As for cultural attractiveness, China was seen as the most attractive country. Almost 90% of respondents evaluated China as economically strong, and more than 83% also viewed the US in the same light, whereas India was seen as the least economically powerful country. A similar pattern of perception can also be seen in relation to military power. China was seen as militarily strong by 90%, whereas Russia was perceived as powerful by 87% and the US was by 86%. India and Japan were seen as having relatively weak military capabilities. In the opinion of Chinese respondents, India was by far the least attractive country and Russia was rated as the most attractive foreign country. In relation to the importance of other powers for the economic growth of China, the greatest majority of respondents said they consider Russia as an important country for the development of Chinese economy. The EU was assessed as economically important to China by more than 70% of respondents. Surprisingly, Japan appeared to be perceived as less important to China. Interestingly, Russia was also seen as the country with the most influence on China, with nearly 82% of respondents believing it has some level of influence. Now let's have a look at foreign policy preferences. Nearly 74% of the respondents are in favor of a friendly policy towards Russia, while more than 61% are in favor of a tough policy towards America. The respondents are largely in favor of common foreign policy options. Nonetheless, it is noteworthy the protection of China's sovereignty and security was the most supported option. finally, we will see the views of Chinese people. One feature of today's Chinese political context is unquestionable support for the One China policy and full control over Hong Kong and Taiwan. The same respondents from mainland China were asked how closely they feel towards other mainland Chinese, Hong Kongers, and Taiwanese. 91% of respondents indicated they feel a sense of brotherhood with other mainland Chinese. The proportion was significantly lower when asked about their connection with people from Hong Kong, which is 67%, and Taiwan, even lower, 56%.
I hope this episode added some value to your knowledge about China's perception on other major powers. After watching this episode, if you are wondering about the opposite situation, meaning how the major powers, especially the EU countries, view China, you could also get that information here. I will see you there.